The dust never settled in the Fergana Valley. It hung in the air like memories of forgotten armies, clinging to the throats of travelers who dared cross the Silk Road's most treacherous passage. In the summer of 751, that dust would taste of blood, betrayal, and the shifting fate of empires. But before we speak of empires, let me tell you about a man who saw it all coming and was powerless to stop it. His name was Li Siye, and if you've never heard of him, that's exactly how history wanted it. The records would remember generals and kings, but they would forget the soldier who tried to save an empire from its own arrogance. This is his story. This is the story of how the greatest army the world had ever seen marched into a valley and never truly marched out again. You see, most people think battles are won by the strongest, by the army with the most soldiers, the sharpest swords, the fastest horses. But that's not how the world works. That's not how it's ever worked. Wars are won by those who understand that strength without wisdom is just another word for suicide. And in the blazing heat of that Central Asian summer, beside a river whose name most of you will never remember, an entire civilization learned that lesson in the cruelest way possible. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you changed the world you live in today, and you don't even know it. Li Siye was 43 years old when he rode into what would become his nightmare. He was a big man, unusual for someone from the southern provinces of Tang, China, with shoulders broad enough to wear the ceremonial armor that marked him as one of the emperor's trusted commanders. But it wasn't his size that made other soldiers respect him. It was his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much and somehow still cared. He had fought in 17 campaigns across the Western territories. 17 times he had led men into the wasteland beyond the Jade Gate, that symbolic border between civilization and chaos. 17 times he had brought most of them home. The soldiers whispered that Li Siye could smell an ambush before it happened, that he could read the land like other men read books. They were right, but not for the reasons they thought. Li Siye survived because he listened. While other commanders talked, he watched. While they boasted in their tents about conquest and glory, he sat with common soldiers and learned the rumors that traveled faster than any official dispatch. He knew that the Karluk tribes to the north were restless. He knew that the Abbasid Caliphate had been sending emissaries into every kingdom, every tribe, every scattered collection of tents between Damascus and the edge of the world. He knew that Gao Xinji, the Korean-born general leading their army, had made too many enemies too quickly. But knowing something and being able to stop it are two very different things. The morning they crossed into the Talas Valley, Li Siye felt it, that cold certainty in his gut that soldiers call the death sense. It was the same feeling he'd had before the ambush at Kashgar, the same hollow weight that had saved his life in the mountain passes of Fergana. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. He rode his horse alongside the massive column of Tang soldiers stretching for miles behind him. 25,000 men, maybe 30. The records would never agree on the exact number, but Li Siye knew every banner, every unit, every commander's voice. They were the finest army in the world, backed by an empire that stretched from the shores of Korea to the peaks of Tibet. They wore silk beneath their armor and carried weapons forged with techniques no other civilization had mastered. They were magnificent. They were also doomed, and Li Siye was one of the few who suspected it. "You're too quiet," said a voice beside him. Zhang Wei rode up, his younger face split by a grin that never quite reached his eyes. Zhang was ambitious, the son of a provincial governor who had bought his way into military service and somehow managed not to get himself killed. Li Siye had taken him under his wing 2 years ago, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because Zhang reminded him of himself at that age, before the desert had taught him that enthusiasm could be just as deadly as cowardice. "You're too quiet," said Zhang. "I'm always quiet," Li Siye replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the Talas River cut through the valley like a silver scar. "Not like this. You get this look like you're calculating how many of us are going to die today," Zhang laughed, but there was an edge to it, fear pretending to be humor. "Not today," Li Siye said. It wasn't a lie. The death he sensed was bigger than a single day. It would take its time. But soon. Zhang's smile faltered. "The general says this will be easy. The Abbasids are far from their supply lines. We have the advantage." "The general says many things." Li Siye didn't elaborate. Criticizing a superior officer was treason, even in casual conversation, especially in casual conversation. Words had a way of traveling in an army, mutating and growing until a simple observation became sedition. But Li Siye had learned to read men as carefully as he read terrain. Gao Xinji was brilliant, there was no denying that. He had conquered cities that had stood for centuries, brought kingdoms to their knees with strategies that military scholars would study for generations. But brilliance could be its own blindness. Gao Xinji believed in the superiority of Tang civilization with the fervor of a convert. He had proven himself again and again, risen from foreign origins to become one of the emperor's most decorated commanders. He had everything to prove and nothing to lose. Men like that were dangerous, not because they were wrong, but because they couldn't imagine being wrong. The valley opened before them like a mouth, steep hills on either side, covered in sparse vegetation that clung to life in the brutal heat. The river glittered invitingly in the distance, a promise of water and relief after days of desert marching. It looked perfect, a natural place to make camp, to rest the army, to prepare for the confrontation everyone knew was coming. Li Siye saw it differently. He saw the hills and imagined them filled with archers. He saw the river and thought about how it would trap an army with its back against the water. He saw the narrow entry to the valley and calculated how long it would take to retreat if everything went wrong. Too long. Always too long. "Sir?" Zhang was watching him, that half-smile gone now, replaced with genuine concern. "What do you see?" Li Siye almost told him, almost explained the feeling in his bones, the way the valley felt less like a campsite and more like a killing ground waiting to be activated. But what good would it do? Zhang would report it to his father, who would mention it to another nobleman, who would eventually let it slip to someone who would take it to Gao Xinji as evidence that Li Siye was losing his nerve. And Gao Xinji would ignore it anyway, because he had already made his decision. "Nothing," Li Siye said finally. "Just dust and heat, same as always." But it wasn't the same. It was never the same. And as the Tang army poured into the Talas Valley like water flowing toward a drain, Li Siye wondered if anyone else felt it, that sense of stepping across an invisible line into a place where the old rules no longer applied, where empires came to die. The camp took shape with the efficiency of long practice. Tents bloomed across the valley floor like silk flowers, organized in precise geometric patterns that demonstrated Tang military discipline. Supply wagons formed defensive perimeters. Fires were lit in designated areas. Scouts were sent to the hilltops to watch for enemy movements. Everything according to doctrine, exactly as it should be. Li Siye walked through it all, noting details that others missed. The way some soldiers glanced nervously at the hills, the tight clusters of officers speaking in hushed voices, the Karluk auxiliaries, tribal warriors who had pledged loyalty to the Tang, peeping to themselves at the edge of camp, their body language all wrong, too tense, too watchful. He found Zhang near the command tent, arguing with another young officer about the best way to secure the horses. Li Siye interrupted with a gesture. "Walk with me." They moved away from the main camp, toward the river where the sound of running water covered their conversation. The sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of amber and blood, beautiful and terrible at the same time, like most things in this part of the world. "Tell me what you know about the Karluks," Li Siye said without preamble. Zhang frowned. "They're auxiliaries, nomads from the northern steppes. Good cavalry, terrible discipline. The general has used them in 3 campaigns. Why? Because they're going to betray us." The words hung in the air between them. Zhang stopped walking, his face cycling through disbelief, shock, and finally settling on a careful neutrality that meant he was taking it seriously. "That's a significant accusation, sir." "It's not an accusation, it's a certainty." Li Siye knelt by the river, letting his hand trail in the cold water. "I've been watching them for 3 days. They're receiving signals, scouts coming in at night, messages being passed. They know something we don't." "Have you reported this to General Gao?" Li Siye laughed, a short, bitter sound. "What do you think?" Zhang was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You were dismissed." "He said I was seeing ghosts, that the heat had made me paranoid, that the Karluks had proven their loyalty in previous campaigns." Li Siye stood, water dripping from his fingers. "He's not wrong about the previous campaigns, but this isn't a previous campaign. This is different." "How?" "The Abbasids aren't just another enemy. They're organized, unified. They've spent the last 50 years conquering everything from the Mediterranean to the edges of India, and they're not conquerors who rule by fear. They convert, they assimilate, they offer something better than what you have now." Li Siye gestured toward the Karluk section of camp. "And tribes like the Karluks, they don't care about the Tang Emperor's divine mandate. They care about survival, about being on the winning side. If the Abbasids have promised them more than we can." He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. Zhang looked back at the camp, seeing it with new eyes. The neat rows of tents suddenly looked less like military precision and more like targets arranged in perfect order. "What do we do?" "We prepare, quietly. We make sure our soldiers are ready for the possibility that when the battle starts, it won't be the battle we're expecting." Li Siye started walking back toward camp. "And we pray that I'm wrong." But he wasn't wrong. He never was about these things. And in the darkness, beyond the firelight, in the hills that surrounded the valley like the walls of a trap, thousands of eyes watched and waited for the moment when everything would change. The Abbasid army was 3 days away, according to the scouts. 3 days to prepare, to fortify, to plan the engagement that everyone knew was inevitable. Gao Shihenzi spent those days in his command tent, surrounded by maps and advisors, crafting strategies that assumed everything would go according to plan. Li Siye spent them teaching his soldiers how to survive when plans died. "Form up, 2 lines, shields forward." His voice carried across the training ground where his personal unit drilled. These were men who had served under him for years, veterans who trusted him more than they trusted their own luck. "Now imagine the man next to you drops his weapon and runs. What do you do?" The soldiers hesitated. It was a strange question. Desertion was rare in the Tang army, punishable by death. To prepare for it was to expect it. "You close ranks," Li Siye bellowed. "You don't ask questions, you don't stand there with your mouth open, you close the gap and keep fighting. Again!" They drilled until their arms shook, until the movements became automatic, until they could fight as a unit even when the unit was falling apart around them. Zhang watched from the side, understanding dawning on his face. "You're preparing them for the Karluk betrayal." "I'm preparing them for chaos." Li Siye took a drink of water, his throat raw from shouting. "I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe the Karluks stay loyal. Maybe the Abbasids don't show up. Maybe I am just an old soldier who's been in the desert too long and started seeing enemies everywhere." He handed the water skin to Zhang. "But if I'm right, and I don't prepare them, and they die because of it, that's not something I can live with." "The other officers are talking. They think you're undermining the general's authority." "Let him talk." "They could report you." "They already have," Li Siye smiled grimly. 3 times this week. Gao Shihenzi called me to his tent yesterday, wanted to know why I was spreading fear and dissent among the ranks. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was preparing my men to win an impossible battle, which is what every good commander should be doing." Li Siye turned back to his soldiers who were catching their breath and checking their equipment. He didn't like that answer. I imagine not. The truth was complicated, and Li Siye knew it. Gao Shihenzi wasn't stupid. He understood strategy and tactics better than almost anyone in the army, but he also understood politics, and politics required confidence, required projecting certainty even when certainty didn't exist. An army that doubted its commander was an army that had already lost. So Gao Shihenzi couldn't acknowledge Li Siye's concerns, even if part of him believed them. Couldn't show doubt, couldn't prepare for betrayal because preparing for it made it seem possible, and possibility could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was a game with no good moves, and Li Siye had long ago tried to win it. He focused on what he could control, his men, their training, their readiness for the moment when all the careful planning would evaporate like morning dew in the desert heat. That moment came on the fourth day, with the sunrise. The Abbasid army appeared on the western edge of the valley like a mirage taking solid form, black banners with gold script, the words of their prophet flowing in calligraphy that transformed warfare into holy mission. They were smaller than the Tang force, maybe 20,000 men, but they moved with the confidence of an army that knew something their enemy didn't. Li Siye saw them from his position on the eastern hills. He had volunteered his unit for scouting duty, which meant they were away from the main camp, up where they could see the whole valley spread out below like a tactical map made real. "Drums," Zhang said, beside him, listening to the rhythmic thunder coming from the Abbasid lines. "They're announcing themselves, giving us time to form up." "They're not worried about us being ready." Li Siye studied the enemy formation, looking for the detail that would tell him what was about to happen. "They're confident, too confident for an army that's outnumbered and far from home." Below, the Tang camp erupted into controlled chaos. Soldiers forming ranks, cavalry mounting, archers taking positions, the machine of empire clicking into gear, ready to demonstrate why the Tang had conquered half the known world. But Li Siye wasn't watching the Tang army. He was watching the Karluks. They were forming up on the northern flank, exactly where Gao Shenzi's strategy had placed them. Their position was critical. They would protect the Tang cavalry's left side, prevent any flanking maneuvers by Abbasid horsemen. They were the shield that made the entire battle plan possible. They were also perfectly positioned to destroy it. "Sir," Zhang's voice was tight. "The Karluks, they're—" "I see it." The Karluk commanders were moving through their ranks, speaking to their men, but they weren't giving the orders you expect before a battle. They weren't checking weapons or reviewing tactics. They were pointing, gesturing toward the Tang positions, showing their warriors where the most vulnerable spots would be when the fighting started. Li Siye made a decision. It was the kind of decision that could get you executed if you were wrong, but he had stopped caring about that 3 days ago. "Signal the men. We're not joining the main force." Zhang stared at him. "Sir, that's direct disobedience of orders. That's the only way any of us survive the next hour." Li Siye swung onto his horse. "We're going to position ourselves between the camp and the northern hills. When the Karluks turn, we'll be the only thing standing between them and our soldiers' backs." 500 men against 5,000 Karluk cavalry? 500 men who know it's coming against 5,000 who think they have surprise on their side. Li Siye looked at Zhang, really looked at him, memorizing the young officer's face in case this was the last time they spoke as living men. "I need you to ride to the command tent. Tell Gao Shenzi what's about to happen. He won't believe you, but you have to try. If I'm right, he needs to know why his northern flank is about to collapse. If I'm wrong, if you're wrong, you'll be arrested for desertion and your family will lose everything. Then you'll have a good story to tell at parties." Li Siye smiled. "Ride hard, Zhang, and if you survive this, remember something. Glory is for poets and dead men. Survival is for those who see the truth and act on it no matter the cost." Zhang hesitated for just a moment. Then he nodded, wheeled his horse, and rode like the demons of the underworld were chasing him. Li Siye turned to his men. 500 faces, weathered by sun and war, looking at him with the trust that only shared survival could build. He didn't give them a speech about honor or duty or the glory of the Tang dynasty. He gave them the truth. The Karluks are going to betray us. In about 10 minutes, they're going to turn on our army and attack from behind. We're going to stop them, not because we can win, but because if we don't, everyone down there dies. He drew his sword. No one will thank us. The history books won't remember our names, but we're going to do it anyway, because that's what soldiers do. We die in the right place at the right time so that someone else gets to live. They didn't cheer. Real soldiers never did before a suicide mission. They just checked their weapons and started moving into position, spreading out along the hillside in a thin line that would have to become a wall made of flesh and steel. Li Siye watched the valley, watched the Abbasid army advance, watched the Tang forces ready themselves for the frontal assault they expected, watched the moment when everything beautiful and terrible came together. And then the drums stopped. In that sudden silence, he heard it. The sound of the Karluk horses turning, the shouts of their commanders giving the order that would change history, the sound of an empire beginning to fall. The betrayal happened faster than Li Siye expected. One moment, the Karluk cavalry were supposedly protecting the Tang northern flank. The next, they were charging directly into the rear of the unsuspecting Tang infantry, their weapons finding the gaps in armor, targeting officers and standard-bearers with practiced precision. It wasn't random chaos. It was coordinated, planned. The Abbasids had clearly worked with the Karluks for weeks, maybe months, teaching them exactly where to strike, exactly how to turn an orderly army into a panicked mob in less than a minute. But Li Siye had that moment, that one precious minute while the Karluks committed to their attack on the main force before they realized there was a Tang unit in their path. "Hold!" he screamed to his men. "Let them come close." His soldiers formed a wedge, a sharp point aimed at the mass of cavalry thundering down the hillside. It was suicide tactics, 500 infantry against thousands of horsemen. But Li Siye wasn't trying to win. He was trying to disrupt, to create enough chaos, enough delay that some of the Tang army might realize what was happening and respond. The Karluk cavalry hit them like a wave against rocks. Li Siye felt the impact through his entire body as the first horses crashed into our formation. Men screamed, horses shrieked, metal rang against metal in a terrible chorus that drowned out thought itself. But the wedge held. For 10 seconds, 20, long enough for Li Siye to ram his sword up through the belly of a Karluk warrior's horse, sending both animal and rider tumbling. Long enough for his soldiers to kill the forward riders, creating a temporary barrier of dead horses and men that slowed the charge behind them. Not stopped, slowed. There's a difference, a crucial difference that meant they were dying instead of already dead. Li Siye fought in that strange space beyond fear, where everything became crystalline and simple. Block, strike, move, drag a wounded soldier back into the formation, stab through the throat of a Karluk trying to flank them, order a section to fall back 10 paces, creating depth so they couldn't be surrounded all at once. It was beautiful, in the way that only perfect violence could be. Every movement practiced 10,000 times until it became as natural as breathing. Every decision made in the fraction of a heartbeat, trusting instincts built from 17 campaigns across 17 years. But instincts only lasted so long against overwhelming numbers. A Karluk arrow caught him in the shoulder, not deep enough to kill, but enough to make his left arm useless. He switched his sword to his right hand, kept fighting, felt blood soaking through his armor in warm streams. Around him, his soldiers were falling, not running, not breaking, just falling, one by one, two by two, the wedge becoming thinner,
weaker, until it was less a formation and more just a cluster of desperate men fighting for a few more seconds of life. And then, through the chaos, Li Siye heard something impossible. Tang war horns, coming from the valley, coming toward them. Zhang had made it, had somehow convinced someone with enough authority to respond. The cavalry wasn't coming to rescue Li Siye's unit, they were coming to stop the Karluk betrayal from destroying the entire army, but the effect was the same. The Karluks, confident in their surprise attack, suddenly found themselves attacked from two sides. Li Siye's battered unit in front, fresh Tang cavalry behind. And in that moment of confusion, of having to divide their attention, they lost their advantage. Li Siye seized it. Forward! Push them toward Dordor.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It was madness. His unit was barely functional, more than half dead or dying. But madness was all they had left. They pushed forward, not trying to win, just trying to drive the Karluks into the valley where the Tang's superior numbers could surround them. A Karluk commander saw what was happening, tried to rally his warriors, to pull them back into an organized formation. Li Siye recognized him, one of the tribal chiefs who had sworn loyalty to the Tang emperor 3 years ago, who had feasted in Gao Xianzi's tent and accepted gold and weapons and promises of glory. Their eyes met across the battlefield. The chief raised his bow. Li Siye didn't have time to dodge, didn't have strength left for anything but one last act of spite against betrayal. He hurled his sword. It wasn't a proper throw. His left arm was useless, and his right arm was tired beyond measure, but desperation had its own accuracy. The blade took the chief in the chest, not a killing blow, but enough to knock him from his horse, enough to send a signal to every Karluk warrior that their leader was down. And without their leader, the betrayal fell apart into individual decisions to live rather than die for a plan that was already failing. The Karluks broke, not fleeing exactly, but pulling back, disengaging, trying to retreat to the hills where cavalry had an advantage. But the hills were already filling with Abbasid soldiers who had expected the Karluk betrayal to collapse the Tang army, not get stopped by a suicidal stand from a unit that shouldn't have been there. Li Siye watched it all from his knees. He didn't remember falling, didn't remember the arrow that had taken him in the leg, only knew that the ground felt solid and cool against his face when he finally collapsed. Someone was shouting his name. Zhang, definitely Zhang. The young officer always shouted like the world was ending, even when it wasn't. Though this time, Li Siye thought, maybe the world really was ending, just very slowly. "Sir, stay awake! Medics! I need medics here!" Li Siye wanted to tell Zhang to stop being so dramatic, wanted to explain that he was fine, just resting, just taking a brief moment to appreciate the fact that he wasn't dead yet. But his mouth wouldn't work properly, too much blood in it, too much dust and pain, and the bitter copper taste of mortality. Instead, he focused on the valley, on the battle still raging below. The Karluk betrayal had failed to destroy the Tang army, but it had damaged it, badly. The northern flank was in chaos. Soldiers were fighting soldiers, unable to tell friend from enemy in the confusion. And the Abbasids were pressing their advantage, driving forward with the confidence of men who knew the battle had already turned. Gao Xianzi was trying to restore order. Li Siye could see the general's banner moving through the chaos, rallying troops, repositioning units. He was brilliant at this, reading the battlefield like a master player reading a game board. Under any normal circumstances, he would turn this around, find a way to victory despite the odds. But these weren't normal circumstances, and victory, Li Siye realized as the world started to fade into gray at the edges, wasn't always about winning. Sometimes it was about surviving long enough to fight another day.
The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was the sun setting behind the hills, painting the Talas River red with reflected light. Or maybe with blood. At that point, it was hard to tell the difference. Li Siye woke to darkness and pain and the sound of an army in retreat. He was on a wagon, bouncing along a road that felt like it had been designed specifically to maximize suffering. Around him, other wounded soldiers groaned or wept or maintained the stoic silence that meant they were dying and knew it. "You're awake," Zhang appeared above him, face illuminated by lantern light. He looked older, haunted, like he'd aged a year in the few hours since Li Siye had last seen him. "What happened?" Li Siye's voice came out as a rasp. "The battle?" "We lost," Zhang said it flatly, without emotion, the way you stated a fact too terrible to process. "Casualties?" Zhang was quiet for a moment. "Half the army, maybe more. Most of our supply wagons, all of our heavy equipment." He looked away. "Your unit, 37 survived out of 500. The numbers hit harder than any arrow. 37. Li Siye tried to process it, tried to put faces to the 63 who had died buying time for an army that lost anyway. Couldn't. Too many faces, too much sacrifice turned into nothing but a footnote in someone's campaign report. "The general wants to see you," Zhang continued, "when you're able to move. He says he owes you an apology." "An apology won't bring them back." Li Siye tried to sit up, failed, settled for turning his head to look at Zhang properly. "What about the Karluks?" "Scattered. The ones who survived fled into the steppes. The Abbasids killed most of them. Apparently they didn't appreciate the betrayers very much either. Funny how that works." There was a bitter edge to Zhang's voice that Li Siye recognized, the sound of innocence being murdered by reality. Zhang had believed in the glory of it all, the honor, the noble cause of spreading Tang civilization to the barbarian lands, and in one afternoon he had watched that belief bleed out in the dust along with half an army. "You rode to warn them," Li Siye said. "It wasn't a question." "I did. General Gao listened. He actually listened." Zhang laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He was already repositioning units when the Karluks turned. That's the only reason we have an army left at all. Your warning, delivered by a junior officer who had no right to burst into a command tent during battle planning, saved thousands of lives." But not enough. Never enough. Zhang stood, preparing to move on to the next wagon, the next wounded soldier who needed water or comfort or permission to stop fighting for a life that was already gone. "The general really wants to see you, sir, when you're able. I think he needs to see you, needs to know that someone who questioned him survived." Li Siye understood. Gao Xianzi was brilliant, but he was also human, and humans needed reassurance that their mistakes hadn't destroyed everything, that there was still a path forward, even if it led through the wreckage of everything they'd built. "Tell him I'll come, tomorrow, if tomorrow existed, if infection didn't take him in the night, if any of us survived long enough to have a tomorrow." "And Zhang, sir, you did well, better than well. You saw the truth and acted on it, even when it meant disobeying expectations." Li Siye managed something approximating a smile. "That's the kind of soldier who becomes more than just another name on a casualty list." Zhang nodded, said nothing, and disappeared into the darkness between wagons. Li Siye lay there, listening to the sounds of retreat, the creaking of wagon wheels, the soft crying of men whose bodies would survive, but whose spirits had been shattered, the measured tread of soldiers marching east, away from the valley that had swallowed an empire's ambitions. Historians would write about this battle, would analyze the tactics and the strategies and the political implications, would talk about how the defeat at Talas marked the end of Tang expansion westward, how it allowed Islam to spread unimpeded across Central Asia, how it changed the religious and cultural map of half the world. But they would forget the real lesson.
the one Li Siye had learned 17 times across 17 campaigns and finally paid for with the lives of his soldiers, that empires are fragile things, that confidence without wisdom is just arrogance dressed in silk, that the strongest army in the world can still lose to a smaller force if that smaller force understands something fundamental about the nature of loyalty, of alliances, of the way power shifts like sand in the desert wind. The Tang would recover, would continue for another century and a half, slowly declining but still magnificent. But they would never again march west with the assumption that the world belonged to them by right. Never again assume that their superiority was so obvious that even barbarian auxiliaries would remain loyal when offered something better. Talas taught them humility, taught them that the world was larger and stranger and less controllable than any map could show. It was an expensive lesson, paid for in blood and broken bodies and dreams that died in a valley beside a river that most people would never remember. But then, Li Siye thought, as pain pulled him back toward unconsciousness, the most important lessons usually were. The dawn came slowly, reluctant, as if even the sun hesitated to look at what had been done in the darkness. Li Siye pulled himself upright in the wagon, every muscle screaming protest. Around him, the wounded had fallen into that strange, silent communion that comes from shared suffering. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say that blood and bandages hadn't already expressed. Zhang appeared with water and dried meat. His armor was gone, replaced with simple traveling clothes that made him look less like a soldier and more like what he really was, a young man far from home, trying to understand how the world could change so completely in a single afternoon. The general will see you now, if you're able. Zhang helped Li Siye to his feet, supporting his weight as they made their way through the camp. It wasn't a proper military camp anymore, more like a collection of survivors huddled together against the enormity of what had happened. He's been up all night, planning the retreat, trying to salvage what we can. Gao Xianzi's tent was smaller than it had been, more practical. The ornate furnishings that demonstrated Tang's sophistication had been abandoned along with everything else that wasn't essential for survival. The general himself looked like he'd aged a decade. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow, but there was still that spark of intelligence that had made him the emperor's favorite commander. He stood when Li Siye entered, which was unusual. Commanders didn't stand for junior officers, even decorated ones. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about what had changed. Li Siye, sit, please. Gao Xianzi gestured to a cushion. I won't waste your time with pleasantries. You were right about the Karluks, about the danger. I dismissed your warnings, and it cost us thousands of lives. Li Siye sat carefully, his wounds protesting. Permission to speak freely, sir? I think we're past the point where rank matters very much. Speak. You weren't wrong to dismiss me, not entirely. Li Siye chose his words carefully. An army that expects betrayal is an army that's already defeated. You had to project confidence, had to believe in our superiority, and make everyone else believe it too. That's what commanders do. That's generous of you, considering your soldiers died because of my confidence. My soldiers died because they chose to stand in the way of cavalry when they could have run. They died because I ordered them to, and they trusted me. Li Siye met the general's eyes. That's on me, not you. We all make choices. Mine just happened to keep some of your army alive long enough to retreat, but it was still my choice, my order, my responsibility. Gao Xianzi was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sounds of camp breaking down continued.
tents being dismantled, equipment being loaded, the mundane tasks of survival taking precedence over grief. "The Emperor will want an explanation," the general said finally. "When we return to Chang'an, he'll want to know how his finest army was defeated by a force we outnumbered, how the Karluks, who had served loyally for years, could turn so completely. Tell him the truth, that the world changed while we weren't looking, that the Abbasids offered something we couldn't, a vision of the future that included the tribes as equals rather than subordinates, that loyalty is a negotiation, not a constant, and we stopped negotiating. That won't be enough. He'll want scapegoats." Li Siye nodded slowly. He'd known this was coming, knew that someone would have to pay for the defeat, and it was always easier to blame individuals than to admit that entire systems were flawed. "Blame me," Li Siye said. "Say my disobedience to orders by not joining the main engagement. Say my absence weakened the northern flank. It's not true, but it's believable, and I'm not important enough that my execution would hurt morale. You saved what's left of this army, and no one will remember that except the people in this camp. History is written by those who survived to write it, and you're the one who has to make the report." Li Siye smiled grimly. "I'm just a soldier who saw too much and somehow lived to talk about it. Use me however you need to." "That's not—" Started again. "You deserve better. We all deserve better. The soldiers who died in the valley deserved better. The auxiliaries who were offered a better deal by our enemies deserved better leadership from us. The Emperor, sitting in his palace in Chang'an, deserves honest reports instead of whatever fiction we construct to protect our reputations." Li Siye pushed himself to his feet, joints popping. "But we work with what we have, not what we deserve. That's what Talas taught me, if it taught me anything at all." He turned to leave, then paused. "Permission to rejoin my surviving unit, sir? We have a long march ahead of us." "Granted." Gao Xianzi's voice was soft. "And Li Siye, I am sorry, not just for dismissing you, for all of it, for believing that our way was so obviously superior that we didn't need to question it, for assuming loyalty because we'd paid for it, for marching an army into a valley without understanding that the valley had already chosen sides." "Learn from it," Li Siye said. "That's all any of us can do. Learn from it and try not to make the same mistakes next time." If there was a next time, if the Tang survived the political and military consequences of Talas, if anyone in Chang'an cared about the lessons written in blood beside a river their name they probably couldn't pronounce. Li Siye made his way back through the camp, each step an effort, each breath a reminder that he had survived when so many others hadn't. Zhang walked beside him silently, offering support without being asked. The surviving members of Li Siye's unit had gathered near the edge of camp, 37 men who had stood against thousands and somehow lived to tell about it. They looked up when he approached, faces reflecting the same exhaustion and grief that Li Siye felt in his bones. He didn't give them a speech, didn't try to explain why their sacrifice had mattered, even though the battle was lost, just stood with them, sharing the weight of survival. "We march east at midday, back to the border, back to civilization. It'll take weeks, maybe months. We'll be short on supplies. We'll be harassed by raiders. Some of us won't make it."
He paused, looking at each man in turn. "But we're going home. And when we get there, we'll tell the truth about what happened here. Not the official version, not the story that makes it sound glorious or meaningful. The real truth. That we were arrogant and it cost us. That we didn't understand the people we tried to rule. That strength without wisdom is just another way to die. One of the soldiers, an older man named Wu, who had served under Li Siye for 5 years, spoke up. "Will anyone listen, sir?" "Probably not, but we'll tell them anyway, because that's what survivors do. We remember, we witness, we speak the truth even when no one wants to hear it." Li Siye sat down heavily, his legs finally giving out. And maybe, somewhere down the line, someone will listen. Someone will understand that Talas wasn't just a defeat, it was a lesson in humility. A reminder that the world doesn't care how powerful you think you are if you can't see the knife coming from behind. They sat in silence after that. 37 survivors of a unit that had numbered 500, surrounded by an army that had lost half its strength to betrayal and miscalculation, on the edge of an empire that didn't know yet how badly it had been wounded. The sun climbed higher. The order came to march, and slowly, painfully, the remnants of the Tang expeditionary force began the long journey east. Li Siye marched with them, one foot in front of the other, ignoring pain that would probably never fully fade. Around him, soldiers who had believed in their own invincibility now walked with the careful steps of men who had learned that belief and reality were two very different things. They passed through the valley one last time. The site of the battle was already being cleaned by scavengers, human and animal alike, stripping armor and weapons from the dead without regard for which side they'd fought on. Death was the great equalizer. In the end, everyone looked the same. Li Siye forced himself to look, to remember, to honor the men who had fallen by refusing to turn away from the reality of what war actually was. Not glory, or honor, or noble sacrifice, just bodies in the dirt and dreams that died with them. The Talas River flowed past, indifferent. It would flow long after the last survivor of this battle was dust, would flow through years and decades and centuries, washing away the blood until there was no trace left that armies had ever fought here at all. Except in stories, in memories, in the way history would pivot on this moment, even though most people would never know why. The Tang would retreat, would secure their borders further east, would stop trying to push their influence into the endless steppes and deserts beyond the mountains, would turn inward, focusing on what they could hold rather than what they could take. And in that space, in that vacuum of power, Islam would spread, carried not just by armies, but by merchants and teachers and the slow conversion of peoples who saw in it something more compelling than what the Tang offered. Within a century, the cultural and religious map of Central Asia would be transformed completely. Historians would debate whether Talas was truly decisive, would argue about the long-term causes and effects, would create complex theories about geopolitics and supply lines and the inevitable decay of empires. But Li Siye knew the truth was simpler. The truth was that they had been confident when they should have been careful, had assumed loyalty when loyalty had to be earned, had marched into a valley thinking they knew how the battle would go, and the valley had taught them otherwise. That was the lesson. Not complicated, not requiring years of scholarship to understand, just a simple truth about power and arrogance and the way the world works. The strongest don't always win. The most confident don't always survive. And sometimes the greatest lesson history can teach is that we should have listened to the soldier who tried to warn us before it was too late. As the army marched east, Li Siye looked back one last time at the valley, at the river, at the place where an empire's ambitions had come to die. Then he turned away and kept walking, because that's what survivors did. They carried the lessons forward, even when no one wanted to learn them. They told the stories, even when no one wanted to hear them. They remembered so that maybe, someday, someone else wouldn't have to make the same mistakes. It wouldn't change what had happened, wouldn't bring back the dead, wouldn't undo the consequences of Talas, but it was something. A small act of resistance against the human tendency to forget uncomfortable truths. A way of honoring the sacrifice by refusing to let it be meaningless.
And sometimes, Li Siye thought, as the valley disappeared behind them, sometimes that was enough. Not victory, not glory, just the stubborn insistence on remembering the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The dust never settled in the Fergana Valley. It hung in the air like memories of forgotten armies, clinging to the throats of travelers who dared cross the Silk Road's most treacherous passage. And somewhere in that dust, if you listened carefully enough, you could still hear the echoes of a battle that changed the world. The sound of empires learning that power wasn't enough, that confidence could kill as surely as a sword, that the strongest army in the world could still fall if it forgot the one thing that mattered most: to respect your enemy, to understand your allies, to never mistake your own superiority for invincibility. Talas taught that lesson in blood, and though most of the world forgot, somewhere in the endless march of survivors heading east, a soldier named Li Siye carried it forward, one painful step at a time.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.